Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our lectures, our continued lectures on the Harvard Classics. We now turn to lecture number 11. We'll be working with John Milton and we'll be talking about Milton's prose. Volume 3 of the Harvard Classics is where we will be. And after the work of Francis Bacon, we turn now to John Milton. First, his prose. In Volume 4 of the Harvard Classics, we turn to Milton's poetry. If you know Milton at all, it's probably the case that you know Milton through his poetry, especially his classic Paradise Lost, a text that we'll have more to say about later. And I've already given a couple of introductory comments on Paradise Lost that are recorded and posted at learnstrong.net. Myself, I kind of came to Milton actually through the prose work, what he called writing with his left hand instead of his writing with his right hand, his poetic work. It's important that we begin with Milton, because Milton is going to be considered one of England's greatest writers during that amazing time when we have people like Bacon and of course Shakespeare writing, but also Milton. We'll study two of Milton's offerings through the Harvard Classics. The first will be his Areopagitica. We'll have to talk about that mouthful of a title. And then as well his essay or his tract or tractate on education, about education. We'll have more to say about that. Now, we've already said in earlier lectures for these Harvard Classics lectures that we need, and I should say we want as well, I hope, to be challenged. And certainly our reading of Milton will challenge us. Now, there's really, in terms of Milton's biography, three ways to talk about Milton. So let's put this in our notes. There is Milton as political thinker. We'll talk about that first. Milton and his intellectual life, his education, is remarkable, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, in another lecture, we'll talk about the poetic Milton. Milton is poet, and the ways in which his poetry is such an integral part of how we understand who he is, and of course his legacy as well. Along with Chaucer and Shakespeare, usually Milton is considered England's greatest writer. Okay, and many have argued that in fact he's probably England's greatest poet. Again, there's always these debates about this, right? Let's do some quick, though, political biography, and then we'll get into Areopagitica, his classic text on censorship, or really what we should call pre-printing censorship issues. Born in 1608, I mean, think about that in your dates and your timeline, right? So we've got 1600 as the year we believe that Shakespeare will perform Hamlet first time on stage. So 1608, he's born, he dies 1674, and in many ways defined by his education. We'll have more to say about that. He is, of course, a brilliant polymath from a very young age. Like Bacon in that regards, we'll put them kind of together, yeah? He cares, we should point this out now for your notes, and especially the essay we're about to work with, Areopagitica, he cares deeply about political issues of freedom, both for individuals as well as for society. Many have argued, and I kind of tend to agree with this, you can't really have a John Stuart Mill and the tradition of utilitarianism without, and Bentham of course a part of that, without having somebody like John Milton. His education is predominantly defined by not just his traveling, but also his reading, prodigious reading. We'll have more to say about that later in this lecture. In our two essays, we're going to see both of these concerns. And we're going to share more, of course, of Milton's biography as well when we get to our study of his poetic ventures, and especially Paradise Lost. Now, let's turn to Areopagitica. Some background information that make this essay a really important one. 1644, let's write that date down, that's an important one. 1644, this essay will be published. It is often referred to as a pamphlet because that's kind of what it was. And the focus here is the right of free speech. Okay, but we should point out with the caveat of with reservations, and we'll get to kind of what that's all about. Now, there is no question this essay called Areopagitica is a really important one in the history of thought in the West, especially about the issues of free speech and the right to say what you think you should be allowed to say, and more particularly print what you should be allowed to print. The title has to do with a hill in Athens, close to the Acropolis, called the Areopagus. Okay, this is a hill where a famous speech was given by Socrates in the 5th century. For those of us who are biblical readers, maybe we'll remember that in Acts 17, there's this famous passage where St. Paul is having a conversation with Stoic philosophers, and they are on the Areopagus as well. Okay. And Paul himself is referred to several times in this essay, we should point out. It is a speech, or it's called a speech, but it's really, truly, it's only meant to be read. A pamphlet about this pre-printing censorship issue. As a Protestant, right, Milton was very supportive of the cases of the Parliament, but the 1643, what was called the Ordinance for the Regulating of Printing, a licensing order of 1643, that for you to publish anything, you had to have the approval of Parliament. This was a line that Milton could not cross and support. And so there's some irony here that we should point out for our notes already, that Milton will publish this pamphlet unlicensed, and it is a direct address right to Parliament. I should point out, because we're going to see this, when you pick up Areopagitica, and again, let me go back and say this for all of these lectures that I've given up to this point. I am aware that you probably have not yet read Areopagitica, and you may never read it. But I'm hoping I can at least interest you in maybe thinking about looking at it, and maybe some of the quotes. Like, for example, if you go to libraries, you're going to see quotes often. In fact, the best library in the world, right? The New York Public Library has a quote from this very essay about the value and the importance and significance of books. I mean, I realize it's ironic that I'm giving lectures on, for example, a text like Areopagitica in a time in which people increasingly seem to read less and less. One of the reasons I'm giving these lectures on the Harvard Classics. But we're still going to have to ask this question: are ideas still important? And the free exchange of ideas still important, even if they're not in the form of books? We think about, obviously, the online debates that we have about online types of exchange of information. As a patriotic Englishman, Milton clearly wants to increase the stature of England by granting intellectual liberty to its writers and its artists. And so, obviously, that's going to be part of his attitude about fighting against any kind of political suppression. Obviously, prior censorship is really what he's talking about here. We'll see. Milton has no problem with censorship after a book has been published if it's, for example, doesn't merit the right kind of values. That he has no problem with getting rid of it. He begins with books, and now we're just going to, as we've done in earlier lectures, we're just going to turn to the text itself and let Milton have his say. He begins with books. And he will say some interesting things. He says, "For books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. Nay, they do preserve, as in a vial, the purest efficacy and extraction of that living intellect that bred them." Now, we think about Milton himself and the way in which that quote works for him. If you want to know Milton, read Paradise Lost, and we'll come back to this conversation about Paradise Lost, or the beautiful prose of Areopagitica. In other words, the writing is a way to kind of contain the author himself, herself, and that, of course, is significant. In regards, he says, he continues with this, he says, "Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Many a man lives a burden to the earth, but a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life." End quote. Whoa. Now, let's just go ahead and say it out loud. We are obviously dealing with a time where books were considered sacred, which does beg an interesting 3B question. Do you think that books are that important anymore? Do you think people actually care that much about books? And of course, at 3A later, we're going to have to ask about our reading of, Fahrenheit 451, that Bradbury text, which always brings to mind the question about the value of books and book burning and censorship and the topics of censorship that always kind of surround our study. Let's go ahead and now look at Areopagitica as a text of multiple arguments. Let's say at least 4 have been pointed out by students of this text, and we'll work through each one of them in order. The first argument that he will give is he begins with the history of licensing, or what we might think of as censorship. And he makes this argument as a Protestant who is very much anti-Catholic. He makes this argument that censorship always is about tyranny of the authority. Think about, for example, he says, Rome in the Roman Catholic Church. Think about the Inquisition. Think about in the 16th century, the Council of Trent and the forbidden books list that are going to be a part of that. Of course, we should point out that really this is probably one of Milton's weakest arguments, and yet it is actually probably one of those arguments that works strongest with those reading at the time it was published who were Protestants themselves, because it's an emotionally based argument. His second argument is a little bit more interesting. He says, we need good and bad ideas in a society if we are going to be free. He says it this way, quote, but only to a, quote, discreet and judicious reader to discover, to confute, to forewarn, and to illustrate, end quote. In other words, we should point out, Milton is not recommending publicly dangerous, evil, erroneous kinds of books, all right? We're going to see in his Of Education, published, by the way, in the same year, he will call these kinds of readers our, quote, choicest and hopefulest wits, end quote. In other words, people who can be trusted with controversial materials, right? He makes the observation, though, that only in confronting evil can one gain a true virtue. Now, this is an interesting argument, and I want to read this passage to you because it's one of the most famous of the passages from Areopagitica. And the idea of having a good virtue, of being a good person, he says it this way. As therefore the state of man now is, what wisdom can there be to choose, what continence to forbear without the knowledge of evil? He that can apprehend and consider vice with all her baits and seeming pleasures, and yet abstain, and yet distinguish, and yet prefer that which is truly better, he is the true warfaring Christian. By the way, there's some debate that in the handwritten version of this, pre-printing, it was actually wayfaring Christian. And the militant language actually does work in this regards. Warfaring Christian. I cannot praise, and now the most famous lines maybe of all of Areopagitica, I don't know. I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race, where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. Assuredly, we bring not innocence into the world, we bring impurity much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. Whoa. Now, we're already thinking about our conversations in regards to Paradise Lost. When we get to Book 9 of Paradise Lost, some will call this Satan's argument. We'll ask you to stay tuned on that one, but let's go ahead and at least say this for your notes. Milton is going to argue in Book 9 and elsewhere in Paradise Lost for the need for what we will sometimes call free will. He will call free will, free choice. That is to say, you have to have both good and evil, and then you have to be able to choose between the two. Now, let's point out that we've already said in earlier lectures on Plato's Republic that Plato argues something quite similar in regards to the need for the capacity of discrimination. However, you'll remember that Plato argues that in the early years of a formal education, that there should be only the good, as he calls it, shown, so that when children grow up and they see the evil, the non-good, they immediately identify it for what it is. The other quote I just want to share with you really quickly here that plays this same game is posted on the New York Public Library wall. Where there is much desire to learn, There of necessity will be much arguing, much writing, many opinions, for opinion in good men is but knowledge in the making. End quote. In other words, if we really want to have a society that understands good and evil, then that society has to be able to choose between good and evil, and the only way you can do that is to have books that will present, dare we say it, evil or bad ideas. Now, within reason, again, is going to be his argument. This is, again, pre-printing censorship that he is very much opposed to. Milton doesn't seem to have a problem with a book being controversial and then selected as being erroneous or evil and then being burned. In fact, he will say as much. The third argument, censorship, he will say, is a waste of time. He makes the argument that, of course, Plato had a certain view in his ideal state of censorship, right, in the Republic. But at least he argues Plato was more consistent. I mean, he's just going to censor anything that would contribute negatively to the well-being of an ideal state. Of course, Milton will point out, we live in a real world. No outside discipline, he will point out, can keep people, quote-unquote, safe from evil ideas. Right? And he makes the argument that this kind of censorship is way too much work for examiners and probably an impossible task to go with it. Finally, number 4, this argument is going to dovetail rather nicely into the earlier 3. He says that licensing or censorship is the enemy of truth. This will, again, remind us of those conversations we've had about Fahrenheit 451. Listen to the way he says this in his Areopagitica. Lords and commons of England, consider what nation it is whereof ye are, and whereof ye are the governors. A nation not slow and dull, but of a quick and ingenious and piercing spirit, acute to invent, supple and sinewy to discourse, not beneath the reach of any point, the highest that human capacity can soar to. Therefore, the studies of learning in her deepest sciences have been so ancient and so eminent among us, that writers of good antiquity and ablest judgment have been persuaded that even the school of Pythagoras and the Persian wisdom took beginning from the old philosophy of this island. Whoa! In other words, notice the English patriotism. We have been able in our culture to share and disseminate the most amazing of ideas. Why would we stop now? The proud Englishmen are fighters. No passive obedience. He continues with this line of thought near the end of Areopagitica. He says it this way: methinks I see in my mind a noble and puissant nation, puissant, powerful, rousing herself like a strong man after sleep and shaking her invisible locks. Methinks I see her as an eagle, mewing her mighty youth, renewing, this almost like a phoenix notion, and kindling her undazzled eyes at the full midday beam, purging and unscaling her long abused sight at the fountain itself of heavenly radiance, while the whole noise of tremorous and flocking birds, with those also that love the twilight, flutter about, amazed at what she means, and in their envious gabble would prognosticate a year of sects and schisms. In other words, the other weak birds looking at England will long to be like England, if and only if we provide this liberty to know, as he will call it. Listen to this final line. Give me, he says, the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties. Now, we should point out, I mean, and these quotes have obviously been lifted from Areopagitica to make the argument that in a free society, there should be total freedom to be able to say what one wants to say. But let's go ahead and point out, Milton is not going to accord this level of freedom, for example, to Catholics or to atheists, but rather to Protestants who are, again, of good wit. Why not to Catholics? Why not to atheists? Well, of course, his argument would be they would use their freedom to destroy the freedom of faithful Protestants, and therefore they need to be censored in some way. He finishes this amazing essay at the conclusion with some words that I will share with you at the very end of it all. His final thoughts at the very end. This I know, that errors in a good government and in a bad, are equally almost incident. For what magistrate may not be misinformed, and much the sooner, if liberty of printing be reduced into the power of a few, but to redress willingly and speedily what hath been erred, and in the highest authority to assume a plain advertisement more than those that have done a sumptuous bride, is a virtue, honored lords and commons, answerable to your highest actions, whereof none can participate but greatest and wisest men. It's an interesting question he asks. Isn't it possible that those making the very rules could themselves be misinformed? And of course the obvious answer is, well, yeah. Final thoughts about this essay. Parliament didn't rescind this licensing for about 50 more years. But we should point out that the Areopagitica remains kind of the standard essay on the importance of books in a culture that considers itself in a society that wishes to be free. Let's, of course, now work at our level 3 and make some observations in regards to how this text relates. Of course, this is a very influential essay. We think about Locke's letters on toleration. We think about John Stuart Mill, who I've already mentioned, his On Liberty, a text that we've mentioned. I've mentioned already Fahrenheit 451 and the book burning. Again, Milton not opposed to book burning. He makes that point clear in Areopagitica. There are books that need to be burned because they are dangerous books. But he believes that all books should have the opportunity of at least being printed, and then we can deal with them in a free society. Of course, we've already mentioned Plato's Republic. You'll remember in our lectures on Plato's Republic that he makes the observation that all of our education is a process of selection or deselection. In other words, a form of a kind of brainwashing, where certain things are shown to you and other things are not shown to you. And obviously the question is, who's doing that showing, especially in your early or your formative years? You'll maybe remember